Before we dive in, a quick practical note. Please silence your cell phones, but don't put them away. We'd love you to join the conversation on Twitter, at AtlanticLIVE. The hashtag is Atlantic Innovators, and we'll make time for your questions for the panelists, too. And now, let's begin. I'm pleased to introduce Marilyn Strickland. She's the new president of the Greater Seattle Chamber of Commerce, and she's the former mayor of Tacoma. And here to lead the conversation is my colleague, Atlantic staff writer, Alexis Madrigal. So, Alexis, take it away. Sure.
All right. It is awesome to be back in the Northwest. I actually grew up in Washington State. I was born in Mexico City, but I grew up in Ridgefield, which is the opposite of Mexico City, 2,500 people in the southern part of the state, north of Portland. And now I live in Oakland, which is sort of the Tacoma of the Bay Area. You laugh like it's the best place. Is that what you're thinking? Yeah. But I have to say, Mayor Strickland, that you went from Tacoma and now you're working in Seattle, which to me kind of feels like the Warriors leaving Oakland and going to San Francisco. How do you feel about switching teams in that way?
Well, first of all, I did not switch teams because we are part of a metropolitan region. And the distance between Oakland and San Francisco is a mere 6 miles, whereas there's 30 miles between Tacoma and Seattle and 90 minutes of soul-crushing traffic. So for me, we're on the same team. I'm here to preach the gospel of regionalism. What's good for Tacoma is good for Seattle. What's good for Seattle is good for Tacoma.
Gotcha. So what is that elevator pitch? Why is Seattle the place for young biotech entrepreneurs?
You know, I would say that Seattle is one of those places that has benefited from organic success. And you know, I think that when you look at all the companies ranging from the Boeing company that has created all these aerospace suppliers to Microsoft, Amazon, which is beget all these other companies relocating up here from the Bay Area or having a presence, and even the fact that we're leaders in retail. We reinvented how you drink coffee, how you have co-op for sporting goods and services. And you know, you think about all the things that have happened here, and in many cases, it wasn't necessarily the fact that there was this big recruiting effort. Big ideas became global footprints here in this area. And so in many ways, talent begets talent, talent attracts like companies, and we're just wildly successful because I think we had the blessing of having some really smart, innovative people choosing to call Seattle home, and these companies have just become leaders in their fields.
Yeah. I was walking around South Lake Union, which, having lived here 12 years ago, I was just like, where am I again? What are these buildings? And just seeing there's so many Amazon employees around. And given Amazon, given Microsoft, two of the largest companies in the world, do you feel like the life sciences here actually get a little bit overlooked because of the kind of outsized success, both of those companies as well as, the kind of retail giant in Starbucks?
No, I would absolutely agree with that. And, there are, I think, over 800 tech companies in Seattle that aren't Amazon or some of these big global brands that we know. And when you look at how the press covers things, the big, well-known brands tend to grab all the headlines. And if you look at the life sciences or biotech sectors, I think that those of us who are familiar with the field have asked ourselves, how many global brands are there that people really know? And as much as we think some of the brands here are necessarily global, with the exception of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation that does a lot of work in global health, I think that because the recognition of some of these companies isn't as great beyond our borders, that there's a tendency to overlook them. But I will say this, though, if you look at where Seattle ranks as far as the life sciences and biotech sector, we have an opportunity. And I say to folks, imagine what's possible if we intentionally look at workforce development, building a pipeline, making sure that the employees and the people doing the research do reflect the community that we serve.
Restarting the basketball league, apparently. That's of crucial importance.
It is. But think about if we did it intentionally, what would happen. And I'm not denigrating the success of any of these amazing brands that have come out of Seattle, but in many cases, it was organic. And so there's a chance here that we have to really think about how we elevate life sciences, how we elevate biotech, and how we get some of those brands out there. Having BMS here is a really, really big deal because most people do know that brand. And so how do we leverage that? And instead of saying we're working with Juno, my question is we want you to have a bigger footprint here. Expand that footprint here and think about how you can work with some of these other biotech companies.
You bring up an interesting point, though, about the organic success of these companies and that there wasn't as much of a concerted governmental effort to create this ecosystem that creates your Amazons and your Microsofts. I sometimes wonder if you can do that.
I think it can. I mean, I think it's possible. In many ways, it's necessary now, because the biggest fight that we're having now when it comes to the needs of business and employers is the fight for talent. And, you have a lot of people who are about to retire or leave the profession. We do not have enough people coming in the pipeline. And when you look at biotech and life sciences, every single job, as you all know, is not necessarily a research job. There are many different disciplines within those organizations. So in a place like Seattle, where the unemployment rate is really low, you are fighting tooth and nail to get talent to want to come work for you. The other question I ask, though, too, is, we don't invest in R&D at a national level or at a state level the way we used to. The other question we have, too, is, we have major research universities, but we don't have enough seats to meet the demands of the students. So we turn students away every single year. So what are we doing to build up that pipeline so that some of these amazing local companies have a chance to expand, to innovate, and to do more above and beyond what they're already doing, which is fantastic work?
What did being the mayor of Tacoma teach you that you're actually able to apply in this new gig?
I would say that being the mayor of a mid-sized city in the United States taught me a couple of things. Really, really big things take time to happen. And you often don't get to enjoy the shade of the tree that you plant. I would say the other thing that's really important, too, is that if you want to do something, you have to bring people along, and you have to be able to communicate clearly and succinctly. Because if what you're talking about requires an interpreter, then you don't have your act together, and you can't get people to come join what it is you're trying to do.
Just staying with the other cities that are around here, how do you deal with Vancouver, British Columbia, which is also its own intense and large metropolitan region?
Well, it's really interesting because there is an effort afoot called the Cascadia Innovation Corridor. And if you look at the big metropolitan regions around the world, we live in Cascadia, and that extends from Vancouver, BC to Seattle to Portland, actually. So we're trying to actually form this unified region, both physically and through intellectual property and innovation, to say we should work together. And one thing that I have said, and some people kind of laughed about it, but marijuana is legal in Washington State. Marijuana is legal in Canada. If we're looking at life science and biotech, we should be leading the charge to look at pain management and how you use cannabis to do some of the work that needs to happen. Because big pharma is already at the doorstep. So why don't we innovate and do those things and sprout some companies and ideas where bigger companies can get involved, buy it out, create more jobs here, and really think about how you build a big ecosystem.
Has the life sciences community been receptive to that message?
Some yes, some no, but I think that there's an opportunity here to think about 5 priorities, how we all get behind it, what it takes to get there, what are the workforce needs, and how do we educate the next group of people who are going to do that work.
I want to ask you a little bit about the competitors to Seattle. I think people know about Boston, San Francisco. Are there other cities that you look at and you say, oh, they're coming up too, and we need to compete against those guys?
When I look at other metropolitan regions that I consider our competition, I will tell you, and I've had the opportunity to travel around the world and to some of those other cities, physically, talent-wise, quality of life, and values, nothing compares to metropolitan Seattle. And people come here, yes, because the jobs are high-paying jobs that do well, but they come here because of our ethos. We believe that climate change is real. We support marriage equality. We believe it's okay if someone wants to use cannabis. There are a set of core values that we have, and people often choose where to locate based on the quality of life. Is that a chamber message for you?
It's good. It's good. I love that the chamber talks about cannabis now. There are roadblocks here, though. Being from the Bay, we are dealing with this housing crunch that is truly insane. We've seen some neighborhoods, increase 2, 3, 4x in median housing price. What's going on here? Because in the Bay, we hear great things about here. You guys have been building hard. Your environmental movement got on board with densifying the city and building up. But at the same time, when you're just out on the street talking with people, they're the rent's too damn high, So there's both things seem to be going on.
So let me give you my very long-winded answer, but just stay with me on this. So we're not going to solve the housing crisis in any metropolitan region, especially not Seattle, in a year or even 5 years. This has been about 2 decades in the making. It's not investing in mass transit the way we should have. It's not anticipating the population that is booming here. It wasn't anticipating the wild success of so many of our companies. On top of that, people are moving back to center cities. And so when you combine all those things, it's hard to keep up with the idea that we're going to be able to solve this in 5 years. We need more housing at all income levels for all people. That's a fact. But I tell folks that housing affordability is often tied to what your income is and what you have to spend on housing. You should not have to own a car to participate in the economy in the 21st century. And if we have a mass transit system and public transit and walkability and proximity of jobs to where people live, that can take a big burden off of people financially. It doesn't mean the housing prices will suddenly fall to the bottom, but it really looks at what your income is and how you're spending your money, and it frees up more money for housing and other needs.
And how do you think the city's been doing, though?
I think the city is trying, but it is a very complicated, convoluted issue. And one of the things you see happening, there's the housing affordability crisis, and this includes working folks, people actually who do really well, and then there's the homeless crisis. And there is a relationship between the two, but the homeless crisis has just as much to do with some of the root causes of homelessness, and that can be everything from mental health to affordability to job loss to a whole set of issues. And so how is Seattle doing? I think they're trying. I see us taking a regional approach because this is not just a Seattle issue anymore. Surrounding cities are dealing with housing insecurity. And so how do we think regionally, and how do we make a big investment? If I had my druthers, I would create a regional housing authority similar to what we did with Sound Transit, where we look at a 3-county region. We ask ourselves where we're going to build housing, what kind, what it will cost, and then say to ourselves, what kind of public investment do we need to supplement the private sector to make this a reality? It could be a really good public-private partnership.
When we talk about economic development, I think there's kind of 2 schools of thought. I mean, one is, a rising tide lifts all boats, and then the other, as a woman I know in Oakland says, well, not everybody has a boat, so what happens when the water comes up?
Or knows how to swim.
Or knows how to swim, and so, the research is kind of mixed on what any kind of high-tech economic development program does for the very poorest people. Mm-hmm. So what should be done at the lower end of the income and educational attainment scale?
So, when I talk to some of our tech partners, I say to them, we think about who works in tech. We look at the types of jobs they have and where people fall. And what typically happens is that fulfillment centers and warehouses tend to end up in the outer rings, and the really, really high-paying jobs end up in the city center. And I say to folks, if you're a person of color, your only option at a tech company should not be in the fulfillment center. And if that's where you start, what is the path to get you to a different job? I think that it's time for some, and you see this happening, I think, in Seattle, where some of our private sector partners are saying, I have a vested interest in investing in the education and training of people so that they can move up the wage progression ladder. So how do we do that in a more intentional way? But, it's difficult. And I will tell you that no one in a million years imagined, like you said, South Lake Union was a bunch of jacked up, dilapidated warehouses. And look at it now. And I don't think we imagined this kind of wild success. And for all the lamenting that people do about a particular large employer, the number of people who use the product is staggering. And so we have to kind of ask ourselves, okay, we're complicit in their success, but sometimes people don't like their success. So where do we think about how we can be helpful but realistic about this company that employs a lot of people really well?
Mm-hmm. Let's talk about Amazon. Is it good or bad for life sciences to have them in the city expanding at the rate they've been expanding?
I think that Amazon is good because it helps put Seattle on a global map, and success encourages success. At the same time, I've heard people say that life sciences and biotech companies need IT professionals too, and now they're competing with these plethora of tech companies here, because it's not just Amazon. Facebook has a presence here. Tableau, there are tons
Google,
of tech
Expedia,
companies. Absolutely, they're all here.
Zillow. Yeah. Well, but what about that, though? The tech company, life sciences competition, good or bad on the whole?
I would say that we shouldn't view it as a competition. We should view it as a way to complement each other and support each other, because in many ways, some of these applications that are happening in the life sciences could use some expertise from IT. And so instead of saying that we're competing with each other, we should ask ourselves, how do we collaborate? But the bigger question, as always, is what is the talent pipeline? Because we cannot import all of our talent for those jobs. We have to find ways for local people who live here to get access to those jobs.
So what do you see, you said that you don't always get to enjoy the shade of the tree you plant. And what do you see, like what's that shade looking out, 10 or 20 years?
I would say that, the reason that we passed these big transit measures in the Metro Seattle area was because traffic became unbearable. And at some point, we're going to have to come to terms with the housing crisis and what it's going to take to actually add more housing. And so I would say that the shade of the tree, for me, the shade of the tree that I don't plant is that when I look at life sciences, when I look at IT, the people in the highest paying jobs look like the community that we represent.
Let's take some questions from the audience for your new Chamber of Commerce head. Do we have oh yeah, we do. I see a hand up and I see a mic. All right.
Hi, my name is Erin Schwartz, and I work for a nonprofit here in town that helps cancer patients to get access to treatment in low and middle income countries. And we do our work through public-private partnerships. Pharma donates the drug to us, and we helped get it to patients all around the world. And so I guess I was curious if you could talk just a little bit more about that public-private partnership piece and why you think it's so important, because I want all our friends here to hear, why it's so important for the public sector and private sector to come together, and why it's almost a responsibility to work together to solve problems. So that's what I want the answer to be. No, sorry.
That's not a leading question at all. Yeah.
So to underscore my confirmation bias for your question, I would say this. The public sector alone is being asked to do more and more every year. And that ranges from the lack of investment in R&D at the national level to divesting in mental health. So the burden is falling more and more in local government. Local government, no matter how hard you raise the taxes, will never have sufficient resources to do all the work. And this is where the private sector can play a role. And here's the other thing I think is important in all of this. Often when you talk about public-private partnerships, there's this assumption among some people that the private sector should do this out of pure altruism. And I tell folks, in the real world, there's self-interest. And it's okay to make a profit off of something, but think about what you're doing and why. And I think if we're able to be honest about what a public-private partnership could look like and say it's okay to make money, then I think that's the way for it to work. But that's a pretty heavy lift in some communities, depending on what the politics are.
Don't be shy.
They had too much wine before this started.
Hi, my name is Jeff Froh. I'm CEO of Intuitive Excel Life Science Incubator. You kind of touched upon this earlier, the fact that the ecosystem of the people, the talent's definitely here in Seattle, and I don't think the talent's going to leave either. But when you take a look at the history of what's happened in the life science ecosystem here in Seattle, companies like Immunex, they got acquired by larger companies like Amgen, and then they promised initially that they would stay here, but ultimately they left as well.
Didn't they go to the Bay Area?
They did,
Yeah.
absolutely.
And that's where Expedia is going, where Amgen used to be.
Yep. So you have the talent here, but then you don't have the ecosystem necessary, the infrastructure necessary to create these anchor tenant companies that we need in the life sciences. So what is the strategy to try to keep companies like Juno Therapeutics here and not get this dispersion of talent as well as the companies outside of the
Can we
Seattle
bounce that
area?
one back to you? What do you think?
I think that, and you touch upon this as well, but I think we need support from the local government. We do. Not only at the city level, but the regional level.
The state
level. There's no question about that. And you sort of brought up this point about how important it is for us to try to create an ecosystem through the state support and through sort of municipal support. And I think that's one of the key things because, again, a lot of the people that are in this room, we have no intention of leaving this area. This is home for me. But the thing is, if we continue to get this sort of exodus of companies that start off here, get really successful at the early and middle stages, but once they get acquired, they leave to the home bases of the acquiring companies, just like BMS, to tell you quite honestly. I hope to God that they stay here.
Me too.
And that's what we would need in order to have a real innovation here in Seattle.
No, and it's interesting because there are two parts to this ecosystem question. Number one, you said you're an incubator. We talk about a housing crisis and affordability. Commercial real estate is really unaffordable too.
Yeah.
And when you're in life sciences, you know this, equipment and lab equipment is expensive. So compound that with trying to incubate, and that keeps a lot of people from even participating. And then when we talk about the ecosystem, we're talking about talent again. And let me give you an example. Someone works at Amazon, and they decide that they don't want to work there anymore. They have a whole slew of different companies who are going to employ them at really, really high wages. The question for me is, does the biotech sector and life sciences have that same ecosystem here where talent can go from one company to another if they choose, and are we able to incubate companies so they can eventually accelerate? But the high cost of real estate has a big factor in that.
Great answer. Thank you. Wow, that thing's beeping at us. Can you hear that? Yeah, great. I think we're out of time then. Thank you so much, Mayor.
Thank you.